Good evening, everyone. How are we all doing? Oh, it's an English audience. How are we doing? I'm Yassmin Abdel-Magied, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this special event organized in partnership with the World Monuments Fund and Intelligence Squared. Unfortunately, one of our speakers, Alberta Whittle, has had to pull out of the event due to adverse weather in Scotland. But I'm thrilled to be joined by three brilliant speakers to explore the role that heritage sites and monuments can play in unlocking Black history. So, we have Bonnie Greer, a playwright, critic, and novelist. She was born in Chicago and has lived in the UK since 1986. Her award-winning plays have been performed at the Royal Opera House and at Soho Theatre, and she was previously Deputy Chairman of the British Museum's Board of Trustees. Please welcome Bonnie. We also have David Harewood, who starred in an array of iconic dramas on screen and on stage, including Homeland, Blood Diamond, The Night Manager, and most recently, Best of Enemies at the Young Vic Theatre. His first book, Maybe I Don't Belong Here, was published in September 2021. Welcome, David. And John Darlington. John is an archaeologist and author. He joined the World Monument Fund Britain, WMF, in 2015 as Executive Director and has worked on conservation projects in the UK that vary from Cistercian monasteries and Georgian mansions through to British brutalist sites and a recently restored Victorian viaduct. He also runs a number of WMF projects in North Africa and the Caribbean. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
So, before we start, I'm going to tell you a little bit about World Monuments Fund. WMF is a charity that champions the conservation of exceptional works of architecture and monuments for people. This could be any type of building or physical site, from the preservation of Nina Simone's childhood home to the majestic Angkor Archaeological Park in Cambodia. What I love is WMF works with partners and local communities to ensure that endangered sites are in their care and have a long-term future. Part of their mission is to engage people in heritage and the stories of places shaped by history, why they're relevant today, and why they're important for the future. WMF has also worked on a number of African sites that we'll talk about today. And I'll also mention that this event will run for about an hour and 50 minutes, and I will be asking you all to ask some questions towards the end. So please, keep some questions along the way. But we'll start with you, John. Tell us a little bit about the key sites of the World Monuments Fund and why you are interested in preserving these places.
Thank you, Yassmin. So World Monuments Fund has been around for almost 60 years now, and our mission is ambitious but actually quite simple. So our mission is to safeguard irreplaceable heritage across the entire world. And as Yassmin said, we've been involved with various different projects, from the temples of Angkor Wat through to the terraces of Machu Picchu, through to the rock-cut churches of Lalibela in Ethiopia, and many other sites which people probably haven't heard of. Part of our DNA is that whilst we operate globally, we own absolutely nothing. So we have no ownership whatsoever. So the really important thing for us, which is the requirement of every project that we work with, is that it's vested in the local community. So the local community is coming to us, asking for help, inviting us in. And that actually creates a wonderful balance for us, because essentially we can operate globally and we can share those messages, we can share our expertise, but everything that we do is vested in something which is happening locally and something which is delivered on the ground. So that's a kind of rather wonderful synergy for us. And one of the issues that we face time and time again is based on the fact that history is not balanced. History is not balanced even in the telling of history, nor is it balanced in terms of which buildings, which monuments, and which stories get preserved and conserved and promoted. So an important part of our role is working with local communities to put a spotlight on what we would call underrepresented heritage. That's very much a fundamental to what we do. And by underrepresented heritage, that's an extraordinarily wide range of heritage sites. So it could include Yazidi shrines in northern Iraq, a heavily persecuted people, particularly by ISIS, through to a piece of work that we're doing at the moment at Bears Ears National Park in the United States, where we're working with the communities there to actually make sure that that traditional knowledge and understanding is translated into the current cultural management practice. And of course, part of what we are interested in is this story that we're discussing tonight about slavery and civil rights. So what does that look like for World Monuments Fund? What's an example of that? And the example I'm going to give is of Bunce Island in Sierra Leone. Bunce Island is essentially in the middle of the Sierra Leone river. It's a couple of miles north of Freetown, the capital. And its location is important because its location is a site which trading ships, it's the furthest site upriver which trading ships could reach. And the trade in which those ships are dealing is, of course, the slave trade. And Bunce Island effectively is probably the most lucrative site in the whole of Western Africa for the transition of slaves from the continent of Africa through to the Caribbean to work in the sugar plantations, or through to the United States of America to work in the cotton or rice fields. And it's really interesting that if you go to Georgia or South Carolina today, there are still linguistic links between people who live there and people in Sierra Leone. So the site itself that we're interested in is a simple place. It's a fortified site with a wall which runs all the way around it. It has got a manager's house, a kind of an operator's house. It's got storerooms, it's got a magazine and all those things. But the main thing which occupies the site are essentially the barracks for the enslaved people who are waiting transit from there. And the next picture shows what the site looks like now, because it's suffering from the ravages of climate change. It's suffering from all kinds of decay due to where it is. So what we're doing, based in the local community, so the local community came to us and said, we would like assistance here, and they came to us as part of a program called the World Monuments Watch Program, which happens every 2 years, where we select 25 sites from across the world which speak to a bigger theme. So Bunce Island is part of the 2016 Watch Program, and essentially we've been working there since 2016, restoring the site, so slowing down that attrition, that weathering, so that it doesn't collapse into a complete ruin, but also working with the community in other different ways. So creating an educational facility there so people can understand what's going on, building local capacity in the site, and creating a visitor trail so people can, again, learn from this particular place. That work's continuing right to this very day, and the World Monuments Fund Principal Program Director is actually in the room. He's just returned from Bunce Island, and maybe we'll hear from him a little bit later. But the main point I wanted to pick out was that if you conserve just some of those physical markers of places which mark slavery, then you have something to hold and to commemorate, learn and to remember.
Thank you, John. And thank you for giving us some context for what WMF does. But what I want to do now is bring it to the individual level, because we've talked about place and we've talked about monuments and how that relates to history. But Bonnie, I want to ask you, and David, I'll then come to you, when did you start thinking about your history and the history of the place that you lived in?
My dad was born in Mississippi, rural Mississippi, and grew up during the Depression. He was born in a town called Money, and that was where Emmett Till was murdered in the 50s. My dad came from what was pretty much what you would call Grand Mal racial segregation. The way that the poll test to be able to vote in Mississippi when my dad was growing up was if you could read Mandarin Chinese. If you couldn't vote. My dad also served in the Army of the United States during World War II. He was here for D-Day, and the Army of the United States in World War II was racially segregated. So if you can imagine the United States fighting World War II and also fighting black men and black women, Americans at the same time. So my background is pretty much, my dad called himself a race man. And that was a term used in those days for what we would call now people who were, very much embedded in blackness. My father had no time for white people except his son-in-law, the couple, a couple of the guys he knew, the priest who baptized us, and ordinary white people, but not the white establishment. So I grew up very much aware on the south side of Chicago, and I grew up at a time when the civil rights era was front and center, was part of my life. I desegregated at school. I was bused to school when I was a kid. When I was a teenager, I worked with Fred Hampton, the Chicago Black Panther Party, and this has been my life. So, there's a lot of things I've seen, a lot of things that, I've experienced. So I would say being a black person, and then an African-American person, as Reverend Jackson told us we should call ourselves, has been part of my life. Always.
You've always had to know history.
Well, always. I thought my father was too until I came home one day with my hair like this, and my father said, "What happened to your head?" So, but other than that, it's always been my life.
And we're going to explore some of what you've talked about with the civil rights, your coming of age in the civil rights movement later, I think, in the event, because it's utterly fascinating. But David, I'm going to come to you. When did you first start thinking about your own history? And you grew up in Britain, the history of the place that you grew up in.
It's actually quite a difficult and complex question for me. You said in your introduction, the title of my autobiography is called Maybe I Don't Belong Here. And from a personal perspective, the question of my history is only something I've really started engaging with in the latter part of my life. And I think that's been really quite unfortunate because, as a young kid, born in England in the late 60s, and growing up in the 70s, we were always taught to sort of assimilate and join in. And you're British, you're English, you're just English. You have no other identity. And as I grew up and I went to drama school and went to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art and threw myself into learning, all these wonderful playwrights and learning about British history in school. But it was only when I came out of school and went into the real world and was rejected by that white establishment, which your father was talking about, rather cruelly rejected by that establishment. That's when I came out of drama school, I had a full-on psychotic breakdown and ended up being sectioned in a mental institution because I couldn't, that rejection for me of being told that I didn't belong or being made to feel that I didn't belong was such a jarring experience for me to be rejected by, almost like being told to go back home. That rejection was a very painful experience for me. And I buried that sort of pain in order to recover from my breakdown, I buried that pain for nearly 30 years. And then 2 or 3 years ago, I did a documentary for the BBC where I revisited my breakdown and was really shocked to uncover that a lot of the discomfort that I was going through was all to do with my identity and race. And because I hadn't taken a grip of my heritage, because I hadn't really understood my heritage, I don't think I had a very sounding board to kind of withstand this rejection. Just to sort of pinpoint it, I can remember. This shows how much my experience has changed. That I remember working in West Yorkshire years ago, years and years ago, almost like 27 years ago, and driving down the road one day and seeing a sign for Harewood House. And I thought, oh, that's a coincidence. It's the same name as me. So I went to visit, had no idea of the history and legacy of the house, no idea. And walked around this house and thought it was wonderful and thought it was fine. And then a couple of years later, I think it was BBC Yorkshire did a piece where they flew me back to Barbados, where I sort of began to understand the legacy and understand my story. You talk about engaging with my story. I started to engage with my heritage. And that's when I suddenly realized that I'm not just a kid from Birmingham. I have this whole legacy that I have to engage with. And it's since engaging with my black heritage, I've found a much more surer footing. I've been to Harewood House several times since then. I know David Lascelles is here tonight, and I've since been back to Barbados and understood my heritage in a very, very different way.
Can we, I mean, is it if you're comfortable, only if you're comfortable, like we can be a bit more specific about what that relationship is, and when you went back to Barbados, maybe the slip of my tongue is to say when you went back to Barbados, I don't know if maybe that's the right thing to say or not, but when you went to Barbados and what you learnt about your family history.
When you learn about the condition, I learnt about the conditions of the slaves, and I learnt about my family, and I was actually given, I think they did a bit of a who do you think you are thing, and they drew a genealogist, traced my family line right back to 1820. And it was really emotional to know that I could sort of reach out and touch, see the very first slave that was given the name Harewood. And from that slave, Richard, his name was, from Richard, he had a son called Bartholomew. Bartholomew had a son called Henry. Henry had a son called Richard. Richard had a son called Cornelius, who was my dad. And when you see that line, I suddenly got a completely different understanding of history, a different understanding of the story of my family.
Of who you are.
And of who I am.
Bonnie, sorry to cut you there,
okay.
but you look like you want to say something.
I do, because this is David and I, we all had a chat before we came on, and as David's talking about, I've been trying to talk to him in public for a long time because I want him to come to the British Museum where I do these conversations, and I want to pick it up here. David and I have both chosen the theater, and the theater has chosen us. You thrive in a country not of your birth, and so do I, okay? I went to Elmina. I have no idea where my ancestors come from, by the way. I have no clue.
For those who might not know, where is Elmina and what is...
Sorry, let me just do that. About 3 decades ago, I was teaching in Ghana, and I went to Elmina on the coast, the Atlantic coast, where Elmina is a slave fortress that the Spanish owned, then the Dutch, the British, and I did a day trip down to the coast. First I went to Kumasi, and I want to say I was with a European, and the reason I wanted to say what he was is because I went to Kumasi with him to look at the Ashanti Henne's palace, the ruins of it, and it was a very hot day, and he was absolutely uncomfortable. He was very red, and I wasn't uncomfortable. And then I suddenly realized, could white people have been up here anyway? So how did I get down to the coast? And that's when I began my investigation of what the story is. And I went to Elmina, and this was before it was very touristy. And I remember standing on the ramparts of Elmina and looking down on the Atlantic shore, and there were black men there, and they were fishing. And I thought, well, who are they? Were they there when I was taken? and who brought me to Elmina. How did it happen? And for one thing, I felt very, you know, the Ghanaians were saying, oh, sister, you're going to cry and everything. Well, people were crying. You know, Americans cry a lot. And, but the other thing I felt when I looked over that rampart and grateful that Elmina was there was that I felt very proud because somebody on that slave ship decided to stay alive. That's how we're here. Somebody on the plantations decided to stay alive. And that's who I'm dedicated to, the people who decided to stay alive and the people on the boat. Because to be on that boat, you had to make that decision. The Caribbean for me, and I've never been there, but the Caribbean for me is like a sort of cauldron of genius, and I'm really, really interested in knowing more about all the languages of the Caribbean. So I want to say that to say that my investigation is how I got to the coast, okay? It isn't so much the enslavement, but I want to know how did I get there? And that's been something that I pursued for a good deal of my life, which is one reason I'm in museums. I want to know how I got there to the coast.
Isn't it fascinating that so much of history or so much of our memories, even if we're not directly related to that particular history, is in place? I think, you know, we're speaking about Elmina or Bunce Island or Harewood House, and we might not even necessarily know what emotion we're experiencing, or we will experience when we get to that place, but we get there and all of a sudden there is, and for me, I find that fascinating as somebody who's been born somewhere, grew up somewhere, lived somewhere else. I think there's, regardless of, you know, how much movement is in our life, place still has a huge impact. And David, before we move on from the Harewood House conversation, I'm curious, you know, what engagement does Harewood House have with its colonial history? And I mean, I'm sure that the conversation has progressed from that first time you engaged with it.
It has, and you know, obviously my understanding of the history behind it has changed. It's a difficult one. I remember you know, going there. The last time I went there was like weeks after the George Floyd was murdered, and it was a very emotive time, and I can remember arriving in Yorkshire and arriving close to the estate, and I started to see the name Harewood on fences and on vans and on doors and on things that were property.
Yeah.
And it was a very complex feeling. I didn't sleep a wink. Even though it was a very comfortable place that I was staying, I was very conflicted with it. And I know that you know, as I say, you know, the house is doing a fantastic job of telling its history, and as David, you know, quite rightly says, you know, he's not responsible, but he can be accountable.
Yeah.
And I think he's been very open and about the house, and very welcoming to me, and very welcoming to the people who have been asking questions, which I think is extremely commendable. And you know, he's not shying away from the conversation. And that's really helped me. It's made it even more complex, because it would be easier to kind of hate him and sort of try and run and burn the place down. But he's actually a very welcoming and very understanding person. So, you know, you have all this passion inside of you, these questions inside of you about the legacy of the house and my name, and you don't kind of know what to do with it. But I think it's important that's why I felt it was important to sit down and speak to my children, who are 17 and 18, and tell them about the house and tell them about the legacy, because I didn't know about it until I was in my 30s. And I think it's really important that they know about it as soon as possible, so that they don't experience that same sort of psychic shock that I did, of suddenly realizing you have a whole legacy, a whole heritage that you just not aware of.
But then the question becomes, what do you do with it? Okay, I mean, I think there's a kind of fetishization, and we have to be very careful about legacy and about heritage, because people can fetishize it, and then becomes useless. It becomes literally useless. History is a construct. It isn't a thing that exists outside of anything else. And as I say on my podcast, it's written by the winners. The losers do not write history. So there's one reason why we know so much about kings and queens, this and that, because they were the king and the queen. I mean, we don't know who built the Ashanti-Henny's compound. We don't know who built Angkor Wat. We don't know who built anything because they didn't write the history. And so, you know, my big thing is about younger people getting, you know, all I call it Wakanda-sized, where it becomes this whole thing about kings and queens. Well, royalty is an oppressive system. So you don't actually want to get into the kings and the queens thing. I'm more interested in the people. You know, who were the people who built these things? Who were the people who were in the cane fields? Who were the people in the cotton fields? Who were the people on the boat? Who were the people? And that's where I am now, is trying to tell those stories.
But that's why I think there is I think there's a move this week with Troy Deeney, the footballer, with a move to try and decolonize the curriculum, which I think is really important, that we do learn other stories, that we learn other legacies, we learn other aspects of history, because a more rounded educational understanding of empire would, I think, benefit people.
We need a deeper understanding. We really do, because it is very complex. I mean, it's a very deeply complicated story, and it's a story of human beings at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I think there's two things I want to add. One is, I think quite often we think of the histories that you're talking about, Bonnie, as sort of forgotten or, you know, maybe underrepresented, but quite often they're actively erased, right? Things are not forgotten just because. Things quite often are actively erased or chosen not to be remembered.
But less than you think. You know, I mean, that's my point. I mean, I think we make a big drama about the erasure, but literally, you know, a peasant or a person who, I mean, using the word peasant as a person opposed to nobility, they didn't even have a last name, and they were white. So, you know, those of us who were enslaved were even more so. I mean, it wasn't, you know, people think there was an active erasure, that erasure was a big active activity. They just didn't write it down. You know, I mean, my last name is the name of some guy from Ulster. I mean, I had no idea what my last name really was. I don't even know where I'm from. You know, I don't know any of those things. So it was, I think we shouldn't make a drama about erasure. We should make a drama about archaeology. I think we need to dig more, just dig more.
So I was going to come in here.
I was going to say, this is perfect, mate. Thank you so much.
As an archaeologist, I should be stepping into this bit. And I guess part of why I love archaeology is because it is biased. Archaeology is biased in lots of different ways, but through archaeology you don't necessarily need to get into that narrative about kings and queens, because essentially when you're excavating whatever people have eaten, the houses they've lived in, what's, you know, their crafts, their arts. You can pick all those things up through the stains in the ground. So so I think there is a democratization through archaeology.
Absolutely, and I think unless we get into what I call deep archaeology, and I mean on a psychological basis too, where you find a story and you don't settle for that story. You go to the story that's underneath that story, and the story that's underneath that story, and the story that's underneath that story, because the transatlantic slave trade was massively complicated endeavor, which used all kinds of hooks from tradition, not only in Europe, but in Africa, and used it to not only make money for people, but to fuel addiction, because this is about addiction as well, sugar and tobacco. Otherwise, it wouldn't have happened. Wouldn't have happened.
I love I've never thought of archaeology as democratizing, but I mean, that's fantastic. And also the idea of like a psychic archaeology as well as a physical
Always
one.
dig, yeah.
We're about halfway through, so I'm going to remind you that we're going to go to questions in about 25 minutes. So start thinking of questions from now. But we're going to shift gears slightly, and I'm going to come back to you again, Bonnie, because you came, as you mentioned, you came of age during the Civil Rights Movement. And there are many sort of physical places that represent or engage in that. Are there any particular physical places that come to mind when you think of the Civil Rights Movement, or even your own personal experience during that time?
No.
Well then.
You know, no, honestly, because, you know, things change quite rapidly. If you grew up in the 60s, there were huge arcs of change. You know, I was thinking someone would talk about the lunch counters in the early 60s. But, you know, my generation rejected the lunch counters. That was actually what we were against. So these weren't places, you know, we weren't, you know, our parents were the turn the other cheek generation. We weren't turning in the other cheek. So the lunch counters don't have, I mean, now if you're 50 years away from it, it does have an arc, you know, sort of a iconic thing. But at the time, that was the last thing we were interested in, was a lunch counter. And so I wouldn't say that there's anything that I think of that is a historic site of remembrance. But people, the further you away from thing, the more iconic it becomes. It isn't at the time. You know, it isn't at the time. In my generation, I suppose if the ruins of Detroit still existed, that would be iconic for me, where young people tried to burn it down. That would be iconic. And probably the Lorraine Motel balcony where Dr. King was assassinated, that's iconic for me. The bridge where the late John Lewis walked across for civil rights, for voting rights, the Pettus Bridge, that's iconic for me. And those things are iconic for me. The Lorraine Motel particularly, because I can remember exactly where I was when Dr. King was murdered. And it was the same time zone as Chicago. So I know exactly where I was. And I could only listen to his voice 2 years ago.
Oh, wow.
From that day, I couldn't listen to his voice. So that motel is iconic for me, but I don't want it to be fetishized. Do you know what I mean? I don't want people to go there and make pilgrimages there, because that's the opposite of what he was about. And in fact, actually, the Civil Rights Movement was exactly the opposite of people trying to put things in stone. I mean, I'm really interested in curating as opposed to obfuscating and worshiping stuff. You know, you have to be constantly active about what these places are about. They can't be about, I'm going to make a pilgrimage to Lorraine Motel. So what? You know, what are you going to do in your life? Because that's what the Lorraine Motel is about. Not about you being there. What you going to do after you leave the monument? And I think the Civil Rights Monument should be active like that, to ask people, fine, you saw it, so now what are you going to do?
What are you going to do, yeah. David, I might ask you to respond to that, because I could see you sort of nodding in your cogs. What, in terms of what Bonnie is saying, how do you feel?
It's different for me, obviously, as a Brit. I have a slightly different take in that, you know, I mean, as I said, growing up at the time that I did, and sort of a lot of these sort of questions for me are all about my sort of kind of fractured identity. This idea that I'm British, English.
So what does that mean?
Well, exactly. You know, but it's. I mean,
to be fair, I don't know if the Brits can. Like, I don't know any Brit that can answer that.
It's like, you know, I've come back. I spent six or 7 years outside of the country, and I come back, and we have a government that, you know, is constantly banging on about the Union Jack, and we should have flags everywhere, and it's the Queen, and so many of those things, particularly the Union Jack, I find the Union Jack a strange object, because a lot of the people, when I was growing up, a lot of the skinheads who were chasing me had Union Jacks, were wearing Union Jacks or emblazoned Union Jacks on their jackets. So, and there was a huge saying when I was growing up, I'm sure most people know it, that there ain't no black in the Union Jack, which was drilled into me as a young kid. So I find myself as a Briton, as an Englishman, but with so many complexes, so many difficulties and sharp objects in my past that sort of keep me from being settled in my own identity. So it's, as I say, I write about it in my book how fractured my sense of identity is, because yes, I'm British and I speak English, you know, but sometimes I don't necessarily feel comfortable here, because so many of the symbols around me don't seem to involve me, or don't seem to be about me, don't seem to include me, and if I let that get out of hand, it just gets very uncomfortable for me.
Thank you for being honest, I think, because I think it's incredibly personal, and
For me, it is a very personal question. That's why I had a breakdown.
Yeah.
This fractured sense of identity, which I've worked hard to put together, and I do feel better having investigated my past and having been back to Harewood House and trying to understand my legacy, my story, my journey throughout my life. But I wouldn't say it's made me feel comfortable in my skin. I'm still, the more I find out, I would say the less comfortable I get, because there's just so many unanswered questions.
My identity is on the slave boat.
That's yours.
That is who I am. I'm of the boat. And my allegiance is to the boat. And being in that middle passage. And once I got on that boat, once I was put on that boat, I had to change my identity. I had to know, because as I'm on the boat, I'm looking straight ahead into the void. And so I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know why my own people maybe put me on that boat. So my allegiance is there. And, you know, I have 2 passports and all of this, and I'm grateful for that. But that's where my nationality is.
Thank you. And John, I'm going to bring you in here, but I'm going to sort of go off script slightly, because you are, you know, with the World Monuments Fund, and there's a question about, you know, the monuments and the important sites in the history of the civil rights movement and so on. But also, ostensibly, you also have an engagement with the same histories that we're talking about in just a very different way. And I'm curious, as you sit here, how you feel sort of both in your role as an archaeologist, but in your role as somebody who, I'm not you were born, you mentioned, in North Africa, grown up perhaps here in the UK.
A little bit.
A little bit,
actually,
but not much. So I'm curious, like, in these conversations around identity, all of us sitting on the stage have various engagements with identity. I'm curious about yourself.
That's a great and difficult question. Exactly. I was born actually was born in Libya, and I've spent most of my life out of the UK, except for a kind of working career. So I've also been a slight outsider, not in the same sense, but that sense of looking in onto this country, which I visit and now is my home. But I think that's in a way that, for me, that travelling background is where I get my sense of identity, and why I became an archaeologist, because I'm just interested in the heritage of multiple nations. That's kind of what, I guess, grounds me, if that makes sense.
Interesting. And in that question of heritage of multiple nations, and also to actually pick up on something you said, Bonnie, because I think you are right, and I think your challenge is fair. Perhaps things are less erased than we might think they are. Part of that also is story and history through like through oral conversations, through oral histories and so on. And this is my very seamless change to a video that we're going to play about some oral history. Do you want to introduce the video, John?
Yeah, certainly. So this is the discussion that we have all the time is when histories are related to places which are not kind of heritage, which is palaces or ziggurats or pyramids. It's the more commonplace heritage. It's where you or I live. It's you know, the terraced house. Is how do you bring those places alive? How do you prompt the discussions which you hope people will leave and take action about? And one of the best ways that we find to do that is through oral histories. And we've run an oral histories project which is based out of the southern United States in Birmingham. And the video that you're about to see, it's a very short clip, is from someone called Teresa Burrows. And she's very much associated with the Safe House Black History Museum in Greensboro, Alabama. And the thing which I find really interesting about what she says is that she says that there's, and I've got the quote somewhere, so just listen out for it, is that we have nothing to show for our participation in this movement being the civil rights movement. We needed something positive that we could see, and so hence this museum, this house is created, and hence the video.
This house was once living quarters for people that worked at the cotton gin, which is located across the street. The people that owned the land sold these houses, and my mother and father bought them. These houses are about 110 years old, but they're still sturdy and strong. Coretta and I had been knowing each other since I think we were 14. We had an organ that my granddaddy used to play. I would be on the organ, and Coretta would sing. She had the most beautiful voice. The people all in this neighborhood would come out on their porches and out on their yard and just stand and said, "Who is that?" I never heard her sing after we grew up. She laid aside her talent. It all went to Martin and the movement. We had been having regular meetings, mass meetings at St. Matthew Church, which is over there. That particular night, we had Reverend Showsworth, T.Y. Rogers, Jose Williams, Albert Turner. You know, Martin was the slowest person. He's slow to speak. He's slow to walk. He's slow to talk. And he was still there talking. So this someone came in the church in such a hurry. And they said, "Is Dr. King here?" And we said, "Yes, he's here." Said, "Don't take him down 14 because the clans are waiting on him." All the churches around was burning. So that's why we brought him here. Every man in the neighborhood, they got to grab their gun, and they surrounded this house. And Martin was in there asleep. He was so tired. He didn't even know what was going on outside. The clans was still riding and looking. We woke him up around 4 o'clock and said, "Hey, we got to get out of here." They took him into Selma, on into Montgomery. Let's just lift him out of here. I had so many pictures. I said, they need to be seen by even the unborn generation that's coming along. We have nothing to show for our participation in this movement. We needed something positive that you could see, walk in there and see, and you can almost feel it as you walk in the door.
Thank you, that was fantastic.
Good.
Yeah. And before we move on from the civil rights monuments, John, I know that WMF does quite a lot of work with monuments and sites of history from this time, but many of them are sort of barber shops and churches and so on. Are there challenges? Tell us about the challenges in preserving these places that perhaps, you know, were quite ordinary, as you say, in some sense, but extraordinary in the historical.
Yeah, I mean, so absolutely. Certain people's perception of heritage is of that magnificent building, and yet heritage is as much linked to people and ideas and movements which might be housed and happen in really very, very modest buildings. So we often have that as an issue that we face. In many ways, sometimes though, a more modest building is easier to get that story across, because whereas I mean, Harewood House, it's lovely to visit, but very few of us, audience accepted, actually live there. Whereas a terraced house in Birmingham or wherever is much more akin to something we recognise. So I think there's something about ordinary places which are connected to extraordinary events which really bring it home. So in a way, it's easier. And the other thing, I think there's a whole different way in which you can engage people in these places. Art is one way, oral history we've just heard is another, music. And then, as Bonnie's saying, the kind of the provocation to action that these places bring about, I think is an equally important way. Yeah.
I think, I mean, I would say, in a similar way, the statue of Edward Colston is probably far more interesting now, sprayed with graffiti and laying on its side. It's far more interesting now than it probably was standing up on that plinth.
And I'm glad it's still intact.
Yeah.
See, that's the other thing I want to say too, because if we take statues down and destroy them, and remember, human beings have been doing that forever. There will come a time, and I promise you, where, you know, let's say Darkest House statue is in that place where it should be anyway, in Bristol. And you can tell a kid, oh, well, this slaver was there. And that kid will say, I don't believe you. I don't believe you. You had no evidence you showed me. You mean Darkest statue was never here? I don't believe it. We have to let people see everything. They have to see it. And that's what curating is called. Colston, the name, I did a program in Bristol about a pub called the Colston Arms that had a battle in which white African-American soldiers and white British soldiers fought white GIs because the black men were allowed to drink in there. Now, if you're an African-American and you come to Bristol looking for that as a place of pilgrimage, you aren't going to find it because they're not using the word Colston. And see, that's the dangerous part of doing this.
All right, we have a few minutes left, so I'm gonna ask you all for final thoughts in a minute, but I'm also gonna encourage you to think of some questions. And if you're actually watching via the live stream, you can enter a question by typing it into the chat box, and it will come through to me like magic. So, Bonnie, I suppose, you know, as you're a storyteller, you are involved in curation, I'm very curious about your thoughts on the moments in Black history we choose to remember, and where do we go from here, given this particular moment in time we're in?
I love hearing you talk. It's a beautiful voice. No, really, you do, when you
very
said
kind.
here, when you said here, that was great. I suddenly heard. I hate nostalgia. So I don't want people to be nostalgic about anything. I detest nostalgia. I detest weeping and crying at places, because that's rubbish.
You should meet my mum.
No, I'm serious. It's rubbish. If we, first of all, I don't believe in getting rid of anything. I think that that's not what you should do. Everything is connected to human destiny and human story, and we shouldn't be afraid to tell the stories. We shouldn't be afraid to do that. And maybe, as I'm thinking of David, because we're both sort of voyagers in a way, maybe the job is to keep telling the story. Just keep telling the story. You know, and I think it's an insult to Africans, especially ancient Africans, to say they were victims. They weren't victims. I mean, these are we're talking about very sophisticated societies that played a part in my being here, and roll the dice, basically. And we need to tell stories in that way. Don't do that to African culture. Don't make African people look like they just suddenly were, the hands up, I can't deal with this. That didn't happen. We're talking about extremely sophisticated people. So let's open up the whole thing. Let's look at the whole story and see it, because in that way, I guess maybe David and I keep thinking about you because of what, we're both kind of troubadours. We're just going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth to kind of find that place, because our ancestors were on boats and around water. I really want to stress that about people in the so-called diaspora. I think that is so important.
Think about the whole story.
Yes, yes.
And John, I'm going to come to you. How, thinking about what Bonnie's just said, how does an organization like WMF make sure that the story remains fluid, right? How do archaeologists not decide this is the story and allow it to continue being told?
Believe me, archaeologists will argue till the cows come home in terms of, and we can do that because the evidence is so ephemeral. No one can get it right and prove it for 100%. I guess in terms of World Monuments Fund, I come back to the fact that we're rooted in the community who live, work, play in the shadow of these places. So I guess the thing which we hold most important is that what do those people feel about the places on their doorstep, and how do we help them to preserve those places and to tell those stories? And they are multiple stories.
To ensure that you're led by local communities, I think, is definitely the way to go. And David, I mean, you've told us, you've shared very openly how the history is still maybe a fractious and contested thing for you personally. I guess, how would you reflect on how we think about history in Britain at the moment and whether or not it's changing? Do you think it's changing?
I think it sort of has to change. I think it has to continue to change. And, I think, we all have to keep engaging with it and not sort of, abiding by one person's view of it. I think what's great now is this new generation, this younger generation, my kids' generation. I'm constantly inspired by my kids and how they share, talk in terms of gender fluidity, in terms of race. They are much more engaged with the questions of race and dual heritage and mixed race, and they're much in terms of the conversation on who they are. They're far more advanced than I was, and far more knowledgeable than I was, and I think that's really exciting. And hopefully, when they're taking care of me when I'm an old man, this world will be very, very different. And I'm hopeful for this new generation that they are different to us, and will take the conversation just a step further.
That's fantastic. Can you all give this lovely panel a round of applause? Thank you. Thank you for an open and honest and really fascinating discussion. Now, this is where you all have to do a little bit of work, right? I'm going to ask you to think of some questions, and if you have a question and you're in the audience and you can make your way to one of the microphones, I think there's a microphone just in front of the stage here, so you can come and share your question.
Way to lower the lights or raise them or something.
Bonnie has asked us to lower the lights again. We would love to see your beautiful faces.
See your faces. Can't see anybody.
Somebody's going to have a question. Who's going to have a question?
Well, we are actually going to start. To kick us off, I think we have Stephen Battle, the Principal Program Director of the World Monuments Fund, in the audience, who's going to come share some reflections, perhaps, from his recent visit to Bunce Island. I don't know if, Stephen, you knew that this was happening, but it's happening.
So, thank you. Look, hard act to follow, that's clear. So, yes, I was just in Bunce Island on Friday and on a trip to Sierra Leone. And look, I think my main takeaway from tonight, so let me just say, we've been doing there is conservation work. I haven't been doing it. Our team in Sierra Leone, which is led by Isaac Smith, who's a very, very competent conservation person, working with the Monuments and Relics Commission of Sierra Leone, with funding from the US Embassy. And we finished this work in 2020. So I was just had the great privilege of going back and seeing what they've done. But so the reflection I take away from tonight is actually how important working on places like Bunce Island is. And it's that personal importance that comes through from the testimony that we've been hearing tonight. I mean, it seems that it's important as a way, places like Bunce Island, you were in Elmina, I haven't been to Elmina, but Bunce Island is very similar, smaller, but similar. It seems to be, it's a way of filling in the pieces in that kind of personal jigsaw. And so, you know, I feel humbled to have been able to participate in this exercise in Bunce Island, even more so than I did before, dramatically more so. So thank you for that testimony, and I will certainly relay it back to the team in Sierra Leone. So thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Now, I have some questions that are coming through from online, but please, if you're in the room and you have a question, would you like to come to, you're welcome to come to the microphone. Go on, yes.
Thank you for a lot of food for thought and an interesting conversation which could go on and on. As the child of two teachers, I was just wondering that as much as there can be preservation of physical monuments, what's incredibly important is the ability to get the message, the stories out there, not to those who know about them, but particularly to those who are either ignorant of it or actually who have been brainwashed in something completely different. Given how much there is in the conversation about what can't be taught in schools in a broader context, I wondered how the World Monuments Fund and the message can be gotten out there in terms of actually broadening the understanding of stories and places that shouldn't be overlooked.
So, I mean, a quick answer from me would be actually back to Bunce Island. And I was talking to Stephen earlier today in the office, and we have run this educational program in Bunce over the last few years, bringing kids from Sierra Leone to the island. And one of the things which Stephen said was that it was remarkable how many of those kids didn't understand, had never come across this bit of their history. That's correct, Stephen? So you know, from my perspective, is start to engage people in those places, because that's what I do. But I think that's just one in a series of kind of tools in the armory, some of which is, as we said, oral history, some of which is art. You've just got to find different triggers to actually get people to see places in a different way.
One of the projects, I'm doing a big project back at the British Museum where I've gone back, and part of the project is working in the state sector. I got my permission to be a citizen because I taught school in the state sector in Lambeth and in Brent, bringing over a Shakespeare program I developed on the Lower East Side. And I remember I started in the beginning of the 90s, and I was told by teachers of color and white teachers, why do you want to teach these kids Shakespeare? I didn't understand the question. I literally didn't understand it. So for me, part of the project that I'm doing called Era of Reclamation at the British Museum is to work with teachers in the state sector, because most of our kids, that's going to be their experience, is going to be in the state sector. I want to particularly work with non-ethnic minority teachers so that they feel confident to deliver Black history to their students. I've told many of them, your white guilt is of no assistance to me. It's of
repeat
no.
That? I think repeat that for the audience.
Oh, I've said to these teachers, your white guilt is of no assistance to my students or to any Black kids or ethnic minority kids. Keep it out of the classroom. Not interested, okay? You're there to teach. You have a vocation. I'm going to help you stand up in front of those kids so that you can deliver this history to them. They're going to challenge you. They're going to do all kinds of things because they're bright. They're going to say what they have to say. But you have to feel that you can stand there and you can do this, because otherwise you are useless in the classroom right now. So that's one of the things that's kind of like my mission there, is to give these teachers in the state sector enough education, enough background, enough confidence so that they can be of use to this generation who's going to pass through their hands, not only ethnic minority kids, but kids who are not ethnic minority. Because that's the way, as David has said, that's the way the world's changing. If you're not on board with this, you're going to be run over. So education to me, and if the fund can help in really I'm very much a tools person. So how do you make tools so that a state teacher can actually deliver Black history, period, history of human beings that is absolutely unbiased, straight, and authoritative? Otherwise, what's the point?
If she could drop a mic, she would. Thank you, Ronnie. Do we have any more questions? Folks, please make your way. Is there anyone? All right, we've had 2 people who are presenting as men. I encourage the women to also get up as well.
All right.
Thank you so much.
First, can I say thanks to David? I think his very frank description of how being Black in this country has impacted on him is huge. Because what it does is it allows the normal ones of us in society, if you like, it normalizes the experience when we talk about the trials and the tribulations of being Black in this country. So thank you. It's a huge thing. Really, I want to talk about the 2 sort of key words that have come out this discussion tonight, which is archaeology and erasure. Around about 16 years ago, I went on a slavery history tour of Liverpool. That's the city where I'm from, as the accent might suggest. And I've always known that Liverpool played a part in slavery. And from that point onwards, come to realise that almost every major building, every park, directly or indirectly exists as a direct result of the transatlantic slave trade. So the legacies of slavery are all around us. The wealth of slavery and Britain's position in the world is all around us. And people seem afraid to tell that story. You said that David was commendable. And we don't want people to prostrate themselves. We want them to acknowledge, and only acknowledging the likes of Troy Deeney calling for it to be on the national curriculum. My question is, I want to come to this hostility, this objection to telling the story. So you'll get a Conservative government that uses words like woke and culture war and all this kind of stuff that actively prevents the archaeology, prevents it. So just if you could just discuss.
Woke came from a beautiful space, and I'm so it's totally been destroyed.
Yeah.
And woke was the word that you used on the Underground Railroad when people were being passed from house to house. How you knew that somebody was the person was you use the word woke, and it got stolen, mainly because people took it out of that and used it publicly, and then people who didn't approve it. I'm going to be making the keynote at the Liverpool at the Slavery Museum in August, and you are 100% right. This country is a colonial project. The pavement, the buildings, the water, everything. So when folks start screaming and hollering about statues, I'm going to say, well, what you going to do about with the ground under your feet? Because that's what it is.
David, can I bring you in as well, David? Because this lovely person has sort of said thank you. And do you have any thoughts as well?
I just would hope that we start engaging with it and start engaging rather than shying away from it, or as they're doing in America now, burning books and trying to stamp out any mention of the word racism or any. They're actually burning books in America right now, which is just frightening. And I think someone's even passing a law as a white discomfort law.
Yeah.
That you're not allowed to make white people feel uncomfortable
when
discussing race. I mean, it's preposterous. But there are stories that need to be told, as you say. Why is that park called Douglas Park? Why is that building called so-and-so building? And unless we engage with that history and have an open discussion about it and all come to an open discussion about it, then we can all start learning about it, start learning about our histories, start learning about why that building was there, why it was built.
Learn about this building.
And just learn
It's
it.
interesting.
Rather than trying to deny that history,
Yeah.
and almost like ruthlessly say it was a. I mean, there are conservatives who will glorify Colston or will glorify a slave trader who say that he may have benefacted the town, but at the same time, there's a million other people who died to get that building built. And I think the more we can talk about these buildings, the more we can engage with the story of these buildings. As you say, I think Liverpool's fantastic in that it has started that tour. The more we can engage with the stories like that, I think the better we'll all be.
Liverpool, we've got a transatlantic international slavery museum, and walking tours happening all the time. Open your eyes.
That's why I'm going
very powerful.
That's why I'm
Very,
going to
very
be
powerful.
speaking, and you know.
Wait, sorry, I'm going to be a moderator
Okay.
and jump in.
All
Thank
right.
you so much, because we've got a whole bunch of questions coming in. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Hi, I just, as someone who is in secondary school currently, I'd like to ask what everyone thinks about the quite poor education around civil rights and slavery and the history of generally all oppressed groups, but of course it's the subject of conversation tonight, of racial inequality. And when we had the education at my school, it was maybe 1, 2, 3 lessons around the transatlantic slave trade, and it wasn't very comprehensive. And I think it's in a country that was so involved with slavery and with empire and with racial inequality and all forms of injustice, from oppression of women to racial minorities and all sorts. I think I'd like to hear what people on this panel would say about the lack of education, generally speaking, on these issues.
Yeah. Thank you so much. David, do you want to take that?
I completely agree with you. I mean, again, we have to really engage with our history and tell all the stories, not just one story, not just glorify one particular aspect of British history, but really educate people about the universal story. And it's only that way that we'll sort of we'll get us all on the same page, because I think there are too many people who have a very narrow view of history, and when only that narrow view gets view, that's when I think people are prone to rather not to engage with the wider story of people, I think.
Can I say too that, and this one thing I'm going to talk about up in Liverpool in August, is you all are too dependent on African American tropes, African American history, African American point of view, American everything. I mean, when I first came here, people were talking about the book that they read to learn about black people was To Kill a Mockingbird. I thought, excuse me? I mean, this book was the book. And when I started talking about, I hate To Kill a Mockingbird, frankly. And yeah, I hate it. And so because it's BS. So to talk about, that book being the book you have to read as a kid to learn about black people, that's where the trouble is. There are a lot of stories that exist about being black and British and about this particular country, but it's still true, and I'm gonna say it, it's still true. Black Britain depends on African American slogans, African American blah blah blah.
It's been very difficult.
Yeah, but it's got to stop because that's part of the problem. I mean, we don't have power, so we don't make the curriculum, but that's part of the problem.
All right, thank you. So we have to do our own work. Thank you so much for the question. All right, we have I'll give you 30 seconds, John, and then we'll have last question. I'm doing a terrible job because we're almost over time anyway.
So my bit of diving in was that there's a book which people may remember. It's called Our Island History. And it's literally a kind of a series of events which is presented as a kind of triumphant series of events for what made Britain great. And I guess part of what we're discussing is actually education is the complete opposite of that linear narrative of my island history. And it's actually, education should be creating inquiring minds to actually understand that complexity of the past in all its different ways. And part of the issue that we're facing with Putin at the moment is because there's one single narrative there. So, you know, that broader spectrum of understanding, I think, is absolutely critical.
Good work on the 30 seconds. Last question.
Thank you. Gosh, the light. Thank you very much indeed. First of all, thank you. That was just so amazing, all of you. It was really, really excellent, and thank you for being so open. Bonnie, just for you, I should just say that I'm chair of Shakespeare's Globe, you might be pleased to know.
Oh, you know I have to come see you, because Shakespeare's my guy. Yeah.
My first question is a bit cheeky, and then I've got a proper question after that, and I'll be very quick with the cheeky question. The summer of '67 was known as the Summer of Love. The summer of 2020, probably with hindsight, will be known as the summer of the Great Awakening, because we had the death of George Floyd, which just made us all look at the world differently. And then we had the Colston statue debacle, the Rhodes statue debacle. And we started to look at things very differently. And I was really interested to hear you use the term Wakandarized, because during that summer, I got a phone call from Andy Serkis, who played Claw in Black Panther. And he said that that movie had been such a revelation to him, and he realized how important it was. And he wanted, when he saw the Colston statue fall, and when he heard all the ridiculous debate around Rhodes, to do something. He said, Margaret, what shall I do? What shall I do? We need to do something. And he originally wanted to take statues and put them into a park. And we decided that you'd have a battle with government forever, and what we should do is to start to tell rounded histories. So we've started something called the Gallery of Living History, sponsored by him and film producer Jonathan Cavendish. And the three of us have started it from the ground upward. We're sort of knitting with fog at the moment, but it's really coming together. Your stories are so amazing that my cheeky request is, as part of my initial curation, can I bring your stories into the Gallery of Living History? Because we're working with school children. We're getting them to understand that this is part of their story. And so that's the cheeky bit.
Absolutely, 100%, yes.
Thank you so much. And
I don't actually think we have time. I'm so sorry.
It's really fast, because it's almost rhetorical.
Are you all happy? We'll take the question? All right,
thank you,
the people have spoken.
The last bit, thank you.
Go for it.
The last question is really, it comes from the fact that I'm Ghanaian, but not from a slave background. I'm afraid that possibly my family, yes, was guilty.
I understand.
And on the other part, I'm Sierra Leonean, and definitely I know that my maternal grandmother came from slaves. So there's this incredible sort of mixed heritage, so to speak, inside of me. And one of the things I found really difficult, as David, is that I love Georgian architecture, and I've always found this incredible pain. And then I started to think, from the side of my maternal grandmother, we built this. And so my question to you, David, is, when you look at Harewood House, when you look at things, can you manage to recoup a piece of yourself by saying we built this? Because there is an enormous amount of black in the Union Jack. It wouldn't be there in the way it is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's a great question. And I have to say, just very quickly, on my first visit to Barbados, unbeknownst to me, the producers had put an advert in the local paper saying, would all Harewoods meet on the beach? And literally 50 people who I'd never seen before turned up on this beach. Some of them knew my dad, some of them knew my mom, but it was a real warm feeling on the beach that day. But when we showed them pictures of Harewood House, they were like, that's ours! They were like, but they felt so proud of it. They were looking at it and they were saying, that's our big house. So maybe we have reclaimed it for that.
Maybe we have reclaimed it. Can you all give an enormous round of applause? Thank you, Bonnie Greer, David Harewood, and John Darlington, for your brilliant contributions. Thank you for all the... I actually have like a suite of questions that have come through here, but I've ignored them all.
I have time. That's a shame.
I know. We could have talked forever. And thank you also to Intelligence Squared and the World Monuments Fund for putting it all together. If you'd like to learn more about the WMF or donate to their work preserving vital heritages, please visit www.wmf.org. Thank you all for coming and have a lovely evening.